Hello and welcome to a check-in video for my 2023 project, which I'm calling A Year of Eno. I've already done 2 videos before this, week 0 where I sort of set the project up, and week 1. Now for this video it's a week late, and that's because I had a problem with my voice owing to the cold that I had, so I've condensed down 2 weeks into one. So this video is a check-in for weeks 2 and 3. So yeah, an interesting couple of weeks in the diary. As I said in the setup video, I'm not going to go into minutiae detail exactly what the diary contains. These check-in videos are more about what reading the diary and just exploring Eno's work in the course of a week, or in this case 2 weeks, sort of resulted in me finding out about, or what rabbit holes I went down, those sort of things. So yeah, for these particular 2 weeks in the diary, he's just got back from a trip to Belgium on Eurostar, and he, in most of the 2 weeks, is taken up with his trip to New York to work on a certain album, or what went on to be a certain album with a certain artist, which we'll get onto in a moment. A lot of his musings I've noticed from the Belgian trip into New York. There's a lot of reflection that goes on in the diary, almost like philosophical in nature, where he's sort of proposing himself questions about things that he's thought about as he's travelling or working. So a lot of those are very European culture and European history in nature. Now, having grown up in the UK, a lot of the references that he makes are things that I'm fairly well versed in, having learnt them at school, so I tend not to necessarily pick those up again. A lot of the things I'm interested in the diary more revolve around things connected with the sort of art he's creating, or the output that he's creating at that time, but also this other thing of looking outside the 95 timeline, specifically at his body of work that he's amassed, if you like, over his creative lifetime. So obviously that's going to affect the sort of things that I'm going to be talking about in these episodes. And obviously when I do these episodes, I have to just focus on a couple of things here and there, so I'm not going down every single rabbit hole, like I said, a lot of them because I've already been down before, and I'm just going to flag up some interesting stuff that's come to me just to start this episode. So around about so that the start of the 2 weeks I'm covering would be the start from the 8th of January. So one thing he does mention, and I did read up a little bit about here, is the death of Peter Cook. So Peter Cook died on the 9th of January 1995. He's a comedian, actor, satirist, playwright, screenwriter. Interesting factoid, my dad, who is a builder and decorator, actually worked for him for a period of time way before his death. I think it might have been sometime in the 70s or 80s, when at that point I think he was sharing a house with Peter Cook was sharing a house with his ex-wife, and it was interesting. I think my dad was trying to navigate obviously the friction that was going on around that time. So yeah, I'm always interested when other people sort of reference Peter Cook, and the connection between Peter Cook and Eno, if anybody's not familiar with this, is that during the recording of the Berlin trilogy, it was not uncommon for David Bowie and Brian Eno to drop into Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's comedic characters, Derek and Clive, and do these Derek and Clive impersonations. So yeah, there's a really cool animation done by Adam Buxton, which is set around that time period. So you've got Bowie, Brian Eno, Tony Visconti in the studio. And I'll include a link in the playlist that I'm starting to accrue. The other thing, while he was coming back from Belgium, he mentions about Popper's World 3. So, if you're not familiar with Karl Popper, he's a British philosopher. And there was a lecture in 1963 where he explores the concept of the three interacting worlds 1, 2 and World 3. And I think the reason why this comes up in Brian Eno's musings, in his reflections, is that he's really interested in what is art and how do you place it in the world, alongside, say, science, and what is the purpose of art. And there's an entry on January the 8th where he's thinking about World 3. So World 3 in Popper's sort of, concept is the realm of the product of thoughts when considered as objects in their own right. And those products emerge from World 2 activity, but when considered as World 3 objects in their own right, they have rebound effects on human World 2 thought processes. These thought rebound effects World 3 objects may, via World 2 based human actions on World 1, have an indirect but powerful effect on World 1. In Popper's view, World 3 objects encompass a very wide range of entities, from scientific theories to works of art, from laws to institutions. I'm not going to go fully into the whole World 1, World 2, World 3 interactions. And the other thing to remember with this is, with this world thing, they're not separate entities. There's no separation between World 1, 2 and 3 in terms of, they're non-overlapping. They interact with one another. And that's a misunderstanding I think I had originally when I stumbled across this a few years ago. Is I thought they were, almost like these non-overlapping ways of looking at the world, but I misunderstood the concept, and now I've actually properly read it through. It makes a lot more sense, and I'm going to include a link to this in the description if it's something you're interested in exploring further. But it was interesting that came up when he was thinking about the place of art and literature in the world alongside science. Another thing that gets mentioned just before his trip to New York is a trip to the cinema at a place called Whiteleys. And it's a place I'd never heard of. And if you're interested in the evolution of the department store, which I actually find really fascinating, how department stores evolved from the context of the UK department store, it's pretty fascinating. Read the article on Wikipedia about Whiteleys, and also you can follow up what it's become today. There's some current overhaul. It's actually been overhauled several times, and the original Whiteleys was in a different location. But it's fascinating reading the whole infrastructure around original department stores as well, and the sheer amount of people that were involved in the background supporting like early department stores. And this, in its original location, the department store goes back to 1867. That's the sort of genesis of it. And like I said, it's fascinating to look through its move, and then the subsequent, I think there's been at the very least two redevelopments. I even went into Street View and had a look, and so I could see what, the current development, although I think the Street View images aren't that up to date. Yeah, so that gets mentioned. Another thing that comes up is DAT as well, digital audio tape. The only thing remotely connected to DAT was there's a Durity Column album, and that was the very first commercially available DAT release, and that was 1987. And I don't have the DAT version, but I have the cassette. And I remember when I bought it at the time it came out, there was a big deal about how the Durity Column had recorded this album, The Guitar and Other Machines, and it was available on DAT. Now, the reason why I bring this up is in the diary he talks about recording directly to DAT. In terms of developing ideas. So I do know there was a period where I think some studios were using DATs as masters for a period of time, like small studios, but it's not, for as far as I know, in reference to that use. It's more just as a way of creating high quality recordings of ideas. And it's interesting to note that the last DAT product, Sony released its last DAT product with the DAT Walkman TCD D100 in 1995, and they continued to produce it until November 2005. And that's when they discontinued the thing. But it had been kicking around since, released in 87. But yeah, interesting format if you're not familiar with it. There was a follow-up, I think, to this all around the same time called DAC, which is digital audio cassette, which is something quite different. But yeah, like I said, the only thing I was aware of at the time was the connection with the Durity Column, and also the fact that it was being used by smaller studios to create masters at that time. I don't know how long that lasted for, because I can remember you could buy these rack-mounted DAT systems. Something else that comes up, so in the reason why he's in New York, from what I gather, is primarily to finish off the recording for what went on to be the Outside album. But in the process of that recording, it makes mention to a track called Dummy, which doesn't appear on the album. And what was interesting about this is it made me aware of how tracks that are intended for one project sometimes end up somewhere else. So they were referring to this title called Dummy early on in January, at the start of this sort of trip to New York to record parts of Outside. And it had these various lyrics, and it went on to, I think, to be referred to as, I'm Afraid of Americans. Now, the track itself was intended for release in the 1995 film Johnny Mnemonic, which is why they were obviously working on it, but it didn't end up on there. It ended up on Showgirls, and was also released as a single in 97. So yeah, that fascinated me. It was almost like a recording in search of an album. But like I said, the bulk of it, and it appears they actually managed to kick out 5 tracks for the Outside album. And you can see here we're getting near to the end of the recording period for this album. So this is the stretch from January to February. I think this period, from what I gather from reading through here, hadn't been quite as fruitful as they'd hoped. There'd been a few false starts. But this appears, once they got up and running, from what he's saying about the trip to New York and everything, it was much more fruitful. And so while he was there, and by the time I get to the end of the 3rd week, he's pretty much back in the UK. So the third week of January. So he was out in New York for almost, I suppose, 2 weeks. And they got 5 tracks kicked out for the period they were actually in the studio for, because you get the impression in the diary there's lots of, I suppose one might say, downtime as people try and come together. So you got Bowie popping in and out and all the stuff he's involved with, and getting sort of frustrated about all the people just milling around in the studio who aren't there specifically for recording the album. And then obviously there's other musicians involved as well, but I think I get the impression he's pretty happy with the fact they were able to knock out so many tracks in the end, so that was good. But what I spent a lot of doing over the last couple of weeks is actually looking through his back catalogue outside of 1995. So I think I'd started off in terms of his solo studio albums, and the previous week I'd got up to about Here Come the Warm Jets. And then for the last 2 weeks of the last 2 weeks I've spent exploring Brian Eno's work outside of 1995. I'm now up to 1978. So I've added these in. I'll show you in a moment. I've added them to the Spotify playlist. In terms of the collaborative albums, up to Here, After the Heat. In terms of, there's nothing from live albums for that year. Nothing for compilation albums for that year, although I don't tend to include those. No EPs. I don't really go through the individual singles because most of them are included on associated other things. So unless something really leaps out, I might do some later here if it doesn't get mentioned. I looked it up a little bit about the film Jubilee, but I didn't re-watch it. I don't know how easy it is to watch that. It's a cult film directed by Derek Jarman, and it's like this alternative reality film surrounding the Silver Jubilee. The connection with Eno is that there's a couple of his tracks are on there on the soundtrack. This was interesting. So I worked through a lot and listened to a lot of his stuff. He was involved with productions, mixes and guest appearances from Here up to... Actually, I did get into 79 at this point. So I did all through this. So yeah, over the course of the last 2 weeks, been slowly working through Here. Obviously, some of this he's purely involved with the production, and his involvement with the production isn't as quite as dramatic, say, on the sound as other albums where he's been involved with. But what was fascinating was listening to some of this alongside his output. I was particularly enjoyed listening to the Robert Calvert stuff, mainly because of Robert Calvert's involvement with Hawkwind. And I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous video, I do find an interesting connection between Hawkwind and Roxy Music on lots of different levels. So it was interesting to listen to those albums. And if you've not listened to these Robert Calvert albums, they're definitely well worth a listen, and I've included them in the playlist. Just to listen to what he was on about. So I'm up to... through the Berlin trilogy now in terms of stuff outside 95. And then I've been sort of just picking through stuff that was going outside, outside of the sort of Eno universe in 95. I'm not sure if anything really sprung. Well, this is really sad reading about this, actually. So towards the end of the period, it's not specifically mentioned in the diary, but towards the end of I did notice that January the 7th was the anniversary of this horrendous earthquake in Japan, and just the death toll just was colossal. So I went onto YouTube and watched a little bit of a documentary about that, just to give me some idea, because I as I thought about it, I do remember the earthquake, but I don't remember the details of it. So it was, I was curious in listening to a few. There was a couple of very moving, like first-hand accounts of the event. So I checked that out. And then we've got this just prior to that. There was this 366 days in space. So that broke the duration record for a space station. There's a few video games come out in that period. When he does mention video games, it's more, I think, of the edutainment variety, because he's thinking about purchasing things for his young daughter or young daughters. So that's where there's only reference to that. I haven't seen any of these specifically referenced. I know he has an interesting, like, computing generally. So I didn't spot any references there. All of this stuff I covered in a previous episode. There was the BBC at that time renamed their World Service. I don't remember seeing any of these films at the time. He certainly doesn't mention in any films at this period specifically. As you know, most of the stuff he mentions is what he's seeing on TV. So that's like TV debuts, and he previously mentioned about The Fly and a few other things. Plus, the documentaries he's been catching on when he's been staying various places. This Tales from the Crypt, I remember seeing, I think the original, was there an original Tales from the Crypt way back in the 80s? So I was curious to see there was another one of these sort of horror comedy. Again, I keep doing these portmanteaus and I don't intend to. Horror-y. There's a soundtrack to go with that. And so we're up album-wise. I've updated the 95 non-Eno album playlist. So we're up to about here. I haven't put everything in, but just put a few albums. Well, I say a few. There's quite a few here. It's interesting to listen to the Throwing Muses album. That's some stuff I didn't listen to at the time. I have actually already added in some of these, but not listened to them. So they may ultimately, as I listen to them, get removed. I don't know yet. Sometimes I do add them in, but I haven't got around to properly listening to them. I'm interested in what's coming up in the next few weeks. This was a pretty major thing on Radio 1. This happened as a result of this whole business of removing old music from Radio 1. There were all sorts of shockwaves went through. So this came out, and this was really major because Steve Wright was a DJ, an afternoon DJ who'd had a slot on Radio 1 at various times of the day, but he was most famous, I think, certainly during the 80s and into the 90s, famous off the back of this afternoon show he did on Radio 1 with all these sort of different characters he made up. So that was a pretty major thing that he left Radio 1. In terms of the charts, so we've got the singles charts. That's basically what was top of the singles charts for the second. You can see we've got Sympathy for the Devil, which just come in by Guns N' Roses. So this was the week starting the 8th. And then the following week, because I'm covering 2 weeks in this, look back to my project. We had Tell Me When by Human League kicking around. These 17 are pretty prominent in chart. And then we've got Oasis starting to get a lot of chart success. It's Massive Attack, Portishead. Album-wise, this period in 95, you can sort of see here's the top 10. So Park Life has been released. That's coming in. The first Oasis album is already in the charts as well. This is a Beautiful South compilation album as a member of the Beautiful South, who was previously in the House Martins, and they were Beautiful South had a succession of hits post House Martins and then into Britpop, so that was sort of capitalising on that success really. Let's look at the following week in the albums, because we're covering 2 weeks. Oh yeah, there we go. There's the Dummy Portishead album. Yeah, so we're definitely seeing an influx of Britpop stuff, of trip hop, and we've got bands like the Cranberries, that album, No Need to Argue. So there's two albums that were released fairly reasonably closely together within a year or so. Were doing really well around that period of the 90s. So I've updated the lists. This now, the stuff related to Brian Eno's back catalogue of work now goes right the way through to the Lodger album. The 95 albums that are just for 95 and aren't Brian Eno stuff. So we've got, if you remember, we've got 2 lists here. Oops, just dragged off a second. Sorry about that. We've got 2 lists here. One is Brian Eno's work generally, in terms of his body of work, and the second list is non-Brian Eno stuff from 95. So at some point here, I'm going to obviously get up to Eno related stuff from 95, so that's why I didn't run a third list. And like I said, these recent ones I haven't had a real chance to properly consume yet, so once I do that, they may or may not get removed, because the idea is to have stuff on here that I like, but I do provisionally add in stuff just while I'm trying to establish whether it's something, because I didn't listen to it at the time, I wouldn't mind listening to now. And then I haven't really appended the YouTube list that much. I added in the David Bowie, Brian Eno, Tony Visconti cartoon there, and this list. I don't know if these were on previously. I've appended these on. They may have been on since last week. I've not added on. This is just a general list for 95, not Brian Eno related. And this is, again, stuff just related generally to Brian Eno, some from 95 and some not. So there we have it. That's my check-in. Well, usually for the week, but because of my problems with my throat, this is 2 weeks. So this is week 2 and 3 rolled into one. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next video.